If there is one thing that people associate most with the First World War, it is the trenches. These defensive features dominated the war between 1915 and 1918, only giving way to the war of movement once again in the latter part of the last year of the war. Any First World War wargame will most likely feature a trench system, but you don't need bespoke trench boards to get them on the tabletop. This fine example is from early war miniatures, and although it is sold as a 20mm scale model, I use it quite happily with my 15mm forces. In fact, I think it fits a 15mm scale much better. In this video I'm going to show you how I painted it, but first of all we'll have some history. I'm going to put chapters in this video, so if you want to leap forward to where I'm actually painting, then you can do. After the initial stages of the fighting in the First World War, the cross lines settled down into continuous trench lines, stretching from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border, forming the Western Front. This happened after the German reversal of the Battle of the Marne and the subsequent so-called Race to the Sea, where the German and Allied armies moved north in an attempt to outflank one another. Hitting the coast meant only one thing: a stabilisation and creation of two continuous lines of defensive trench systems. Initially these were quite rudimentary, the Allies in particular having the notion that after the winter of 1914-15 movement would once again return to the battlefields. However, the Germans had other plans and chose locations in captured territory that favoured the defender, this being on the top of hills, following the contour lines and having dominating views across the landscape. In their ability to choose where they wanted to create their defensive line, the Germans chose well, and this stopped any Allied victories apart from the occasional local victory where the German lines were broken into, but not through during 1915. As the time passed, the German army dug deeper and stronger trenches, but both sides were developing their own systems where millions of men slept, lived and fought. By the middle of the war, in 1916, trenches had several aspects to them, mainly being split into fighting trenches and support trenches, with several lines of both making up a complete system, connected by communication trenches. Fighting trenches were generally crenellated, like the top of a castle, to help with local defence. By making small sections of trench bays, it was difficult for an attacker to fire a rifle down the length of the trench. It also shielded the occupants in other trench bays from an exploding shell and grenades. Each of these bays would have a firing step, which elevated the firer above the parapet to use their rifle. It also meant that men could stand upright in a trench when not on the fire step and still be protected from rifle fire. Support trenches were trenches built just behind the front line trenches, housing firing bays, mortar pits and other support weapons. Communication trenches connected the horizontal lines of trenches, and these were generally zigzagged in shape to allow the movement of men coming into and out of the front lines and support trenches. In the British Army, units were rotated out of the line every few days, and these communication trenches were one-way routes for this purpose. Also, supplies of food and other necessary items for living and fighting in a trench would be brought up the communication lines, while casualties would also be moved out of the front lines through them. They were busy places, but men were not supposed to idle in them and were to keep the flow of traffic moving. However, by 1917 things were changing. The Germans no longer had their trenches on the front-facing slopes in the landscape, and they moved them behind the crest, mainly for protection from artillery, but also for security purposes. Small saps dug forward would house observation officers, but generally the trench was hidden from view from the ground. It would require aircraft and aerial photography to seek out the enemy. Changing yet again, especially during the Third Battle of Ypres, shell craters were used as defensive positions, interlocked with concrete pillboxes to gain a field of fire across any potential area of attack. These craters would be joined together by small saps, and they were mutually supporting. Once again, this made the task of spotting them difficult in a shell-torn landscape. But fully fledged trenches had still not disappeared from the battlefield. For example, the Germans dug their Siegfriedstellung, also known as the Hindenburg Line to the Allies, in late 1916 and early 1917, and they fell back to this strong defensive position. This shortened their line, and it also increased their defensive capabilities. But development in tactics and weapons, such as grenades, rifle grenades, light machine guns, aircraft, tanks and even artillery, meant that trenches were a problem to be solved, and they certainly were in 1918. The German army took the initiative in spring of 1918, launching their largest offensive to date in the West since 1914, and pushed some 50 miles through the area where the British and the French armies met. Ultimately, it was a strategic failure, and their inability to capitalise on their gains meant that in August of 1918, the Allies launched their Amiens offensive, which captured all the previously lost ground back and pushed the Germans back until November 1918, during which the Hindenburg Line was breached and a breakthrough had been achieved. So, with the history lesson out of the way, let's begin painting this early war miniatures trench system. This is a typical defensive trench from 1917 that has been dug as part of a discrete defensive position. It is a vac-formed model and very light. I began by trimming off the excess plastic of the edges, so it will blend into my tabletop a little bit better. I use a sharp knife for this and cut away from my hands wherever possible. I next move to undercoating the model, and for this I use a rattle can spray of burnt umber. I'll list all the materials that I use in the description of the video below. I just give the model a good coat of spray. You could do this with a brush, but it will obviously take longer. Just make sure you are in a ventilated room, outdoors, or wearing a mask. With the undercoat completely dry, I began adding some texture to the ground areas. You could leave this stage out, but adding some sharp sand here will help you with the dry brushing later and remove that slightly moulded look of the model. I painted undiluted PVA glue over the areas I wanted to texture and then sprinkled sand over that, making sure to cover all the glued areas. For this, I also add some railway modeller's ballast and chopped up cork pieces to add different textures and lumps of soil. To seal this in, you could spray it with watered down PVA glue, but I didn't bother as the next stage will seal the sand anyway. Once the sand and the PVA has dried thoroughly, preferably overnight, I begin sealing the sand with another spray of burnt umber. This time I'd give it 2 coats and this will help hold the sand in place during games. Make sure you get good coverage and get every bit of sand that you can see. Once again, I leave this to dry overnight to allow the spray paint to completely cure, and then using Decor Art Fawn acrylic paint, I begin the dry brushing stages. This paint is a good cheap paint, which is a light khaki colour, and I use it for a variety of highlighting tasks. Taking a big, soft makeup brush, I dip the brush into the paint and wipe off as much as possible before lightly passing over the model. I go over everything, including the base of the trenches and other bits and pieces. Do this lightly at first and build it up until you feel it needs more. You still want to be able to see the burnt umber below. Then, using the same brush and technique, I use Vallejo Stone Grey to go over the model once again. This time in a lighter touch than the previous stage, but enough to bring out the highest highlights. I don't bother cleaning my brush between these dry brushing stages, as a mix of paints helps a nice transition between the two. It is then time to start the detailing, and I start with the sandbags. For these I use Vallejo's Brown Violet, which is a nice match for the First World War sandbags, but use whatever colour paint you want for this. I use a biggish brush and quickly paint each bag. Don't worry about overspill, but try to be as neat as possible. We can hide some overspill of paint with the weathering, but it's better to be neat the first time around here. Corrugated iron sheets were used for riveting trench walls, and this model has a number of them on the edges of the trench sides, including a sheet of elephant iron over the small dugout at the rear. I painted this in gunmetal by Vallejo, using a medium-sized brush. Whilst the sandbags and iron sheets dry, I begin painting the wooden duckboards and uprights in Vallejo Stone Grey. This is a good colour for old wood, and it will be highlighted and dulled down later, so don't worry about how light it looks at the moment. I also paint the wicker riveting material on the trench edges in the same colour. I do this like a heavy dry brush, giving a good coverage but allowing some of the colours below to show through. Then, using fawn again, I go over any small ammo boxes or wooden bits and pieces that are modelled into the piece. This is a good wood colour for fresh, untreated wood, and again, we'll be dulling this down later anyway. Whilst I let the wood dry, I go back to the metal sheets and I cover this in Florrie Wash Rust. This is a clay wash which goes on quite bright, but dries with a nice dull colour and has a nice rusty texture which is perfect for what we need here. Then I go back to highlighting the wooden trench boards and uprights using fawn again. This is a light dry brush. Once again, we want to see the stone grey below this layer, so don't go too mad when applying this layer of highlighting. Then I do a final highlight with stone grey once again, and go over everything in the trenches, including the sandbags. This will then blend everything together and trick the eye into thinking they are all part of a single object rather than individual and stark items. Now it's time to dull everything down, and for this I turn to Citadel's Agrax Earthshade. This is a great wash that will get into all the nooks and crannies and give a nice blended look to the model. Use a big brush and make sure you go over all the wood in the trenches, the metal sheeting and the sandbags. and then leave this to dry overnight. Once the agrax is dried, I give the sandbags a heavy dry brush of brown violet once again, just to bring out the highlights and blend that agrax wash just a little. I then do the exact same again with fawn, but on the wooden parts and the trench interiors once again. This again will take away any of the starkness of the agrax wash and make the highlights pop once more. Now the trench is painted, it's time to protect it with some Winsor & Newton Professional Artist Matte Spray from a rattle can. This is the best varnish on the market as far as I'm concerned, and it finishes the model in a nice dulled down matte finish while also protecting it for the tabletop. And then the final stage, which is adding some static grass. For this, I paint patches of PVA glue in random areas across the model and scatter the static grass across them. Blowing on the grass here will make it stand up a little, so I don't really need an applicator for this. This will also break up the shape of the model, and it adds a nice splash of colour, which also adds some interest. And that's it, complete, ready to be garrisoned by some stout defenders. The trench took a few days to paint from beginning to end, and most of that time was drying time. It was largely a series of layers of dry brushing, which may seem superfluous, but they add layers of texture and blending that wouldn't be there if you only did one layer of dry brushing. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please leave a like and a comment. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe and check out my Patreon and channel memberships. Thanks for watching.